Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture to show the relevance of theology to everyday life. I'm Kasey, Olander. I'm the web content specialist here at the Hendricks Center. And today our topic is neuroscience and spirituality. What relationship does our brain have with our spiritual life? And we're joined by Dr. Ekpedeme Wade. She is a DTS professor at the Houston campus. She's also an MD, and she's a therapist and founder of 12-2 Counseling. Ekpe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Kasey.
I'm very interested in this conversation. I think that you who are listening are going to find it riveting as well. So I guess I'll just start off with, Ekpe, what is neuroscience, and then how did you become interested in its intersection with spirituality?
So neuroscience is the science, the study of the brain and all things that encompasses. And I became interested in it, intrigued by it, really, because I see our spirituality having so much to do with the way our mind works, what we think about, our emotions, how we see the Bible, how we view God naturally. A lot of it is kind of based on how our brains develop, the trauma, the experiences, the modeling that we have that shapes our brain that affects how we view God and our relationship with God. And I just think it's intriguing, and I love studying it and talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is very interesting. I guess let's dive right into what impact can are you talking about like our lived experiences, or more like biologically what we're made of? What are the things that impact the way we view God, for example?
Both really. But in my line of work, I tend to talk to my clients more about our lived experiences, about our childhood experiences, the modeling we had with our family, our parents, our guardians, the training that we had, what was spoken into us, what wasn't spoken into us, how God was presented to us or not presented to us. All of those things absolutely shape how we view God and how we enter into a relationship with God. Okay. For some of us, it's very easy, right? For some of us, those experiences, those childhood experiences were positive. And so we see God in this positive way, and it's easy to believe the Bible and know that it's true and have a deep connection with God. For others, it's not as easy because of how God was presented or what was told to us, or experiences that may be communicated, there is no God, or God doesn't care about you, or this situation is too big for God to handle. There are kids and adults that have experiences that those kind of thoughts and words are spoken. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to have that deep connection and trust with God based on those experiences.
Okay, so then why don't we get into, if you have these early childhood experiences, let's say the ones that teach you false things about God, like that he doesn't care about you, for example, then is that just an insurmountable obstacle, or what happens after that?
Yeah, definitely not insurmountable. It's difficult for sure. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of people it takes intentionality, but it is doable. The brain is neuroplastic, right? So it changes, it forms. So as our brains are developing from childhood onto early adulthood, those messages and those experiences are actually doing something to our brain. Like those neurons are connecting in a specific way. Those neurons are firing in a specific way based on our experiences and based on what we're learning. But it doesn't have to be permanent. When truth comes in, if those neurons are connecting with lies. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. There is no God. When truth enters, you say that truth enough, you believe it enough, you read it enough, you experience it enough, those neurons can learn to rewire and fire in a different way.
Yeah. Neurons being what comprises the brain physically?
Yes. So they are the nerve cells. They're nerve cells. We call them neurons and the brain, and we have billions of them.
Okay, yeah, and then the more that they fire together, then they wire together and create these pathways, so that if at first it was about something that wasn't true about God, then the neuroplasticity you're talking about is what actually is really hopeful, because it can reform different pathways to make us recall what's actually true about God, that he does care about us, or that he does love us and exist even.
Correct. And that's why, we talk about different spiritual practices. Those spiritual practices help actually reshape, reform our brains and the way that the neuron fires. If we talk about meditation, meditating on his word, meditating on his promises, meditating on God's character, the more you do that, the more you read that, the more you say it out loud, the more you sing it, it becomes truth. It is truth, but you actually start believing that truth. And your nerves, your neurons start believing it as well. And so they're firing a different way.
And that is really interesting, that what we do physically, and, we think of them as spiritual disciplines, what these things do, actually impacts the way that our brains are. Which is fascinating. But let me go back to that, the idea of meditation that you brought up, because isn't this getting a little bit into, maybe some Eastern ideas, or, what is it about meditation?
Yeah, so I think there is a often preconceived notion that mindfulness and meditation are Eastern or New Age. Mm-hmm. But if I look into the Bible, I think that they are definitely biblically rooted, and they are long-standing practices in the Christian community. What I see as a difference is that kind of the Eastern way of meditation talks about emptying the mind, mm-hmm. Emptying your mind and maybe not going anywhere. But what I see in meditation and mindfulness in the Bible is filling your mind with, again, God's promises, the truth of the Bible, being present in the moment, being mindful of God's presence, his words, his works.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you tease that out for me one more time? The difference between, you talked about meditation as you can do it by saying things out loud or by singing, or mm-hmm. over and over, but then also can you, distinguish one more time between what mindfulness is?
Yes, good question. So meditation, so the Hebrew word meditate literally means to mutter or to speak quietly. So meditation, in my view, is not an emptying of the mind, but it is thinking through, pondering through, speaking through, or like I said, singing through. If we're talking about from a Christian standpoint, everything that has to do with God. Mm-hmm. So if you are reading the Bible, saying it out loud, if you're singing a song that is, like a Christian song that's based on scripture, that is meditation. If you are thinking through, biblical passages and verses and saying them, reciting them to yourself, or even to your friends in passing in conversation, that to me is meditation. It's not an emptying, your mind is going nowhere, but it's literally speaking, uttering these words. Whereas mindfulness is more of kind of being in the moment, being present, understanding what is happening in the here and now. So with my clients, a lot of that is somatic, like what is happening to your body right now? What is happening to your emotions right now? It can be an emotional present. So not thinking through what happened yesterday or what's going on tomorrow, but being present, being mindful in the here and now. And I think sometimes we think like, I'm here, I'm talking, like I know what's going on with me, but are my shoulders tense or not? What's happening to my voice? Being mindful in your body, in your emotions, in your thoughts, in the here and now.
And that's a really helpful distinction, because the word mindfulness sounds like it's only a mental thing, but you're pointing out that it has to do with your entire body, like your entire person. Yeah. How do you help people cultivate this self-awareness for, like, what if I don't know that my shoulders are up here by my ears, you know?
Yeah. It takes intention. I think we live in a culture where it doesn't help us to be mindful, like we're always on to the next, like what's happening next. And so if we're present in the moment, we feel like we're missing out on something or we're wasting time. So I don't think we live in a culture that cultivates mindfulness. So it does take intention to stop and recognize what is happening right now. And I think one of the ways that we do that is by simply asking the question. A common question that I ask with my clients is, like, what's happening in your body right now? Because they might not notice it, they might be talking about something, and I notice maybe that their body shrinks down or gets riled up. And so asking them, and that forces them to stop and think, wait, what is happening to my body right now? What is going on with my body right now? Sometimes it takes pointing it out. I do that. Sometimes I point that out to my clients, and, I'll say, I noticed that your shoulders went up a little bit. Oh, I noticed that your head hung down. What's happening right now with you? So, and these are questions that you can ask yourself. If you are working on being intentional, when you're feeling something, when you're noticing, like, I'm having a bad day, you can ask yourself, what's happening right now in my body? Where do I feel that in my body?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that increases our self-awareness to then, okay, maybe next time I notice, like, my chest tightening, then I can realize, oh, I'm more anxious about this than I thought I was, for example.
Exactly.
Is there always, are you looking to assign meaning to these things when we look physiologically, like what's happening with our bodies? Do they always mean something?
They usually mean something, yes. So recognizing them is the first step. And then we get to assign a name or feeling to it. And then you go a step further and start to understand why. So if my shoulders are tensing up, then, what feeling is associated with this response, with this physiological response? It could be anxiety, it could be fear, it could be stress, you get to assign what that is. And then you go a step further and, like, why? Why am I feeling stressed in this moment? What about my environment or the words that were shared? What about my thoughts? What about what is going on right now is causing this emotion, which is causing this response?
And all of this together encompasses mindfulness?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Very cool. So what impact does it have if, hypothetically, we all had little tiny devices that beg for our attention, like every few minutes?
You mean like
a cell phone?
Like a what?
Like a cell phone.
Yeah. I mean, that takes away, that steals the mindfulness that we could have. Our attention is being pulled in so many different directions, with electronics, with work, with family, stress, everything. And so we have gotten, as a community, as a culture, we have gotten into a pattern of just busyness. That is like the norm for us now, is just to be busy every second. And if we're in line in the grocery store, then we're wasting time if we're not on our phones scrolling through something, or if we're stopped at a stoplight. We have to be doing something. And I think that is, that it's not good. and I think, again, it steals from this, what the Bible talks about, meditating on his word day and night, even if it's not meditating on God's word, like the stillness and the quiet that we have in so many moments throughout our days allows us to hear God. And it's so difficult to hear God if we're busy 24/7, if every second is filled with our phones, our laptops, our devices, our watches,
And that's a great point, because silence and solitude are like classic historic Christian disciplines that have been really, a lot of times neglected in today's age. A lot of us are so rarely silent. There's always, music or a podcast, no judgment.
Yeah. And the thing is, silence is so uncommon. It has become so uncommon in our culture that silence is uncomfortable to so many people.
Right.
That if there is silence, it's like, wait, what's wrong? Why are you not talking? Why is there, what's going on? But I urge people to become comfortable with silence, because again, that's, I think a lot of the times we become uncomfortable with it because when they're silent, then our thoughts go. And so a lot of we see a lot of anxiety come up at night when people are busy throughout the day. And then when they lay their head to go to sleep, there's stillness and there's quiet. And then their thoughts go awry, and then they ruminate. And it's like, oh, wait, I can't go to sleep because my thoughts are going 1,000 miles an hour. Because now your thoughts can, because they're silent. But if we allow that silence and that stillness to pop up throughout the day, then it doesn't have to accumulate at night, where it becomes overwhelming and you can't go to sleep. But a lot of us are uncomfortable with silence because then we're left with our own thoughts. And
if your own thoughts have been neglected for, X amount of time, then, of course, they're uncomfortable or overwhelming, or it takes a lot to sift through.
You have to deal with them. Sometimes we distract ourselves with life because we don't want to deal with our emotions or our thoughts.
Yeah. How do I really feel? What do I actually believe? And
Exactly.
So how do you help people to cultivate this awareness, but without judgment of themselves? Because I think that's a lot of, if I'm aware of my own thoughts, I'm not going to like it or whatever. But how do you help people to wade through that?
Yeah. Building an environment, building a space where they understand and they know and believe and experience that there is no judgment. That, understanding your thoughts, and that some of them may be ugly or you may not like some of them, it's okay. We're human. But in order to change the things that you want to change, if those are thoughts that you want to change or grow from, we have to recognize them and we have to talk about them.
So I guess you would encourage people to not only become self-aware, but then also to share these thoughts with other people, to actually live in community and be known.
Yeah. And that is the scary part, because some of us don't want to admit our thoughts, our beliefs, our emotions to ourselves, but then having to admit that to somebody else is even scarier. But, in the past few years, loneliness has become like an epidemic. And I think one of the reasons why loneliness is so rampant is because this sharing of our innermost thoughts and emotions and beliefs with loved ones or in, safe spaces is so difficult. We don't do this. So we sit with our own stuff, and then we feel like, I might be around people all day, but they don't know me. That's because you're not sharing yourself with them. And so helping people to take that step, it is a very courageous and very scary step to take. But doing it in baby steps, sharing just a little bit of yourself with people, with safe people, and practicing that helps to build that connection, and helps for you to like deal with your thoughts. And what we experience a lot of times is people like, oh, I do that too. I think that too, and that helps build connections.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe it's C.S. Lewis who has a quote about, that friendship is born at the moment when someone says to another person, you too? I thought I was the only one.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So then I noticed that you made an important distinction, like that you're sharing with like safe people and loved ones. You're not like sharing with the whole world, and it's not like just throwing a social media blast out there is what's going to like help me be known. So how do you help people identify like who is safe to start sharing with as I'm trying to develop this appropriate vulnerability?
Right. I ask, who around you do you trust? Who around you do you feel comfortable sharing this information with? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't have that many safe people in our family or in our social circles. And sometimes it's a matter of engaging with people to build that trust, to build that connection so that you have a safe person. If there's nobody there, I encourage people, why don't you grab this person and go to lunch and just start talking about anything, because those little things start to build a relationship, and hopefully a trusting and caring and safe relationship. And so it's just trying it out for some people. And there may be a couple, and if my mom, my grandma, or somebody, but none of my friends, will start with your mom and your grandma, share this information with them, and then slowly build some of your friendships to be safe relationships. But I think that's why counseling is so important and so different from just friendships and relationships, because counseling, when you're in that office, it should be a non-judgmental zone. People are free to be themselves and to say things that they've never said to anybody in their entire life, and get to experience what, saying that out loud and not having judgment come back at you feels like. And hopefully that builds some of the courage for them to take that outside to their daily life, and try that out with other people.
Yeah, almost like a muscle that you're working, gradually, and that it takes time and you have to be patient.
Exactly.
I would love to be able to lift 50 more pounds tomorrow, but
yeah. But you got to start with the 5-pound weight today and then build up to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how do you help people to decide? I mean, I know that obviously when somebody comes to you for counseling, they've chosen you as their counselor. How do you help, like your students, for example, to pick a counselor, or even, anybody else in their life that they're going to like start this next step with before they move to like either friends or family or whoever, for sharing? Like, how would you advise people to choose like a counselor, a minister, a doctor, or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am a big proponent of trying people out. Okay. So I think most counselors will cooperate with you if you say, hey, I just want to have like a 5 or 15-minute chat with you to see if we're a good fit. Because the counselor is a very important part of that counseling relationship. And I do believe that there has to be a connection there, that you have to feel that, this is somebody that I can open up to. This is a place where I feel like I can be myself. And you don't have that with everybody. You can have a great counselor out there, but there's something about them. Whether it's their gender, whether it's their age, there's something about them that doesn't fit with every client. And so you just have to find who is a good fit for you. And so calling, researching, maybe consulting, asking for a 5 or 10, 15-minute consultation just to find out a little bit more about them. And then choose. And if it's okay if you do a session or two and you feel like it's not a good fit, that's okay. That's not a fail. Mm-hmm. There are more counselors out there that you can seek after.
Yeah, that's hopeful. And again, that goes back to that patience, like you'd love to find the perfect counselor today and, just have the exact right, safe people to be vulnerable with. But I mean, the reality is that a lot of those things take time. And it seems like an indication of health a lot of times that, it's not just to spill your entire life story the first moment that you meet someone, but to kind of take steps at a time.
Yeah. And I think their theoretical approach is also an important one. And that's something that you can ask if you're calling for a consultation. What's your approach? What do you specialize in? What's the primary focus of your therapy practice? Those are important aspects to building a strong counseling relationship.
Sure. If I want to work through trauma, then I want to find somebody whose specialty is in trauma, for example. Yeah. So shifting back to the areas that we were addressing earlier, what difference does it make to see ourselves, as we enter into this, like, okay, I'm looking to be known and to grow as a person. What impact does it have that we're like material and immaterial beings as humans? We talked about the spiritual practices, and we talked about like the way that it physically, like physiologically changes our brains. What impact can that have in our just, I guess, relationships with other people, but also just in our ministering?
Yeah, it can have a lot of impact, honestly. There are studies out there that show that meditation and mindfulness, for example, decrease stress reduction, they increase compassion. Like if you're doing like a loving kindness meditation, it can increase compassion and pro-social behaviors, and that impacts your relationships. Decrease stress impacts your relationships. If I am focused on my spiritual practices of meditation and being in the Word, I may be less apt to get stressed and yell at my kids. I might be, there's that space that's created from, an initial emotion to a response, where that space has been created to where I'm like able to think through, okay, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling, this is how I usually respond, but I'm going to take a step back. And so it can impact all of our relationships and our social well-being.
Yeah, because if I'm more compassionate, then, okay, that's the way that I interact with not just my husband, but also my coworkers and also the people at my church and also, whoever, my students or whoever I'm around.
Yeah. And there's some things that we just can't help, right? Like we live in this busy society and burnout is real. And, a lot of us, especially in the helping professions, if you're a pastor, a counselor, a teacher, and you're constantly having to give and give and give, burnout can happen very quickly. But if we are rooted in God's Word, and if we, again, with mindfulness and meditation, that busyness is there, and we may not be able to get away from it, but there's something that we can do about it to help ourselves and those around us kind of live in it a little bit more peacefully and godly.
And that's really hopeful too, that, I don't have to forsake all society and go live by myself to do these things.
Right. That's one way to do it.
I could try.
That's one way to do it. But if we are to be in this world, we don't have to be of this world. We can maneuver through it a little differently.
Yeah, there's practices that I can do while I still, maintain all of my, whatever things might be stressful, like work or family or school or whatever. I can still have those things to steward what God has given me, but also having these practices of mindfulness and meditation can maybe anchor me so that I can move through them without being overwhelmed by them.
Yes.
Okay. So How do you, I guess, where do we see mindfulness and meditation in Scripture? We touched on it a little bit earlier, but as we're looking at the Bible, where do we see these things play out?
Yeah. So I see a lot of it in Psalms, right? Even just Psalms 1, where it talks about delighting in the law of the Lord and meditating on his law day and night. A lot of, mindfulness and be still and know that I'm God, meditating on his precepts in the Psalms, meditating on his promises in the Psalms. I mean, it's there. And again, I love, if someone was to go out and study kind of meditation in the Bible, what I see is that God is telling us what to meditate on. Like, this is, it's not an emptying of the mind. It's meditate on me, on my presence, on my works, on my word, on my promises. He tells us what to think about, what to utter, what to say aloud, what to think about. And so I see that, excuse me, I see that a lot through the scriptures, especially in the Psalms. And when we talk about mindfulness, I love using the example of Jesus, where Jesus was always leaving to go to a solitary place to go pray, just, again, being in that stillness and that quiet. Early in the morning, he would wake up to go be with his Father and pray to his Father. And so I see that mindfulness there with Jesus. But then I think also in the scriptures, there's a lot of verses about using your cognitive abilities. Like our relationship with God is not just an emotional one. It is a cognitive one as well. In James 1, it talks about thinking about our trials and troubles in a positive way. There's so many scriptures about what to think about, where our mind should go. And I think that in itself points to mindfulness. In Philippians, it talks about whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's pure. Think about these things. Paul tells us to take every thought captive. So there's that cognitive part of our brain that is in absolute relationship with God as well.
Which is a really good point, that we can engage the Lord intellectually. It's not just it's not just physical, where I can, pray on my hands and knees, for example, or it's not just emotional, where I can feel God's comfort, but it's also intellectual, which is, a fun thing for us. We're at DTS, which is an academic institution. And so I think a lot of us are interested in that already. But I think that, for me, you keep highlighting these multidimensional aspects of our relationship with God.
And I love that because, God created us as a whole being. And so our entire being, our whole being needs to be in relationship with God, not just part of us.
Right. Yeah. And that's beautiful because he wants our entire being too. It's not like, can you keep that mess to yourself? It's Jesus came for, the messy parts of us and came to redeem us and give us relationship with himself. So how would you help our listener to understand the I don't know if I want to call it a tension or maybe a relationship between thinking and feeling. We've talked about mindfulness as awareness of our emotions, but we've also talked about, this cognitive facet of our relationship with God as highlighted in scripture. And so our thoughts really matter. I think it's easy to try to prioritize either one over the other. Either your feelings don't matter, we can't listen to them, they're not reliable, or, it's not just an academic exercise, our relationship with God is more than academic. So I guess how do you reconcile these things?
Yeah, I think it can be difficult for some people to delineate their thoughts from their emotions. It's very interesting when I ask my clients a lot of times what I feel, what are you feeling right now? That's a very counseling question that you get in every session. What are you feeling right now? a lot of the times the response will be, I feel like this. And if you're answering, I feel like X, Y, and Z, that's not a feeling. That's a thought, that's an assumption, that's not a feeling. And so I point that out. Well, I feel like that person didn't understand what I was saying. Okay, well, that's an assumption. But so that just in the way that you answer that question can delineate what is a thought and what is a feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we have to go back to basics, which is not bad at all. In my counseling office, I have a list of emotions. Mm-hmm. And so when I ask people how they feel, sometimes I bring that out and have them point to, what are you feeling? I feel powerless. I feel unworthy. I feel unloved. I feel unsafe. Those are very kind of specific emotions and emotion words. Mm-hmm. And our thoughts are not any more important or less important than our emotions. I think those two go hand in hand. Cognitive behavioral therapy thinks that, that our emotions, our thoughts drive our emotions drive our responses. So they're all interconnected. And so it can be a matter of just having to teach what is the difference between your emotions and what's the difference between a thought or a belief that you have.
That's really interesting. And that's a really helpful, I feel like, oh, okay, yeah. That's a good trick.
Yeah. I feel like is usually not followed by an emotion.
Mm-hmm. Nobody says, I feel like sad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about, you can correct me if you don't like the term, negative emotions, but we've talked a lot about emotions that are a bummer for people, like powerlessness and feeling unloved and these kinds of things. So what value is there to exercising these same practices of mindfulness, but about more positive emotions, or at least emotions that we enjoy feeling? What language would you use there?
Yes. So that's where we want to go, right? If you're experiencing positive emotions, understand what's bringing out that positive emotion and do that more. And if you're experiencing quote unquote negative emotions, figuring out where that lies, how do you usually respond to that? And then I don't like to communicate that quote unquote negative emotions are wrong and we have to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. What I like to highlight is those negative emotions are there for a reason. If you're feeling sad or if you're feeling unloved, there's usually a reason for that. We're not walking around wanting this emotion. Mm-hmm. There's usually a valid reason for that, whether it's past experiences, whether it's true or not, it's there, it's valid. And so what we want to focus on is our responses to these emotions, because these emotions can be very overwhelming and can drive a particular response that may not be healthy, may not be helpful. So we recognize the truth and then we change our responses, carrying these negative emotions with me. So if I feel sad that something happened, and I usually respond by isolating and, eating a tub of ice cream, I can recognize the truth that I'm sad because this thing happened and it's okay for me to be sad, but I'm still loved and valued. Mm-hmm. Okay, now how am I going to respond based on being loved and valued and not based on being sad? Well, I'm going to engage with my friends. I'm going to go out. I'm going to take a walk. And so that is a healthy response to a quote unquote negative emotion, right? Mm-hmm. And I can still carry that sadness with me as I'm with my friends, as I'm taking a walk.
Right. That sort of goes back to that, non-judgmental, just an awareness of being sad, for example. That doesn't mean we have to be sad about being sad. It's just mindfulness allows us to realize that we are sad and then maybe like make a choice to respond with a healthy coping mechanism instead of, a tub of ice cream.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very true. I think one of the reasons why our negative emotions can feel overwhelming or can feel pervasive is because we don't validate them for ourselves. We call them bad, when we feel guilty or shame, or we feel like it's wrong and I shouldn't feel this way. And so it makes it even harder to get out of that, where it's like, no, you're sad. Okay, bring that sadness along with you and let's go do something about it. Validate those emotions, that they're there. They're there for a reason. But we do get to choose our responses to those negative emotions.
And you highlighted the Psalms earlier, which just run the whole gamut of emotions. There are plenty of Psalms of lament, and it is not just, like happy-go-lucky, but there are a lot of different emotions about, like feeling, Lord, why have you abandoned me is not the same as thinking, like that's my theology.
Right. And we see what the writer of the Psalms did with those emotions. He went to God with them.
Right.
He presented his emotions to God. Not shaming himself or not feeling guilty or not isolating, which are very common responses to negative emotions. But if we, present them to God, that's doing something different, and he will do something different with them.
And going to God, he's not like, wow, this is a complete surprise to me. With what brand new information? Like he already knew, even if it's news to us. Yeah. I mean, this is Philippians 4. Like if we're anxious in every situation, God is saying by prayer, by petition, by thanksgiving, present your requests to me. And then what will happen? Like the peace of God will guard your hearts and your minds. Like, just if you're anxious, if you're stressed, if you're burnt out, come to me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What a comfort that God accepts us as we are because of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
That we get to go to him and whatever emotions, whether we consider them positive or negative.
Yeah. And that's the opposite of what for a lot of us, our natural instinct is. It's if I'm stressed and anxious, it's okay, let me get myself right before I can enter back into, before I can have my quiet time, before I can read, before I can pray. Let me handle this, stress and emotion myself and figure it out. And then I'll go back to God. And that is the opposite of what God tells us to do.
Right. Yeah. He invites us to come to him. So what resources would you recommend for people who are interested in learning more either about mindfulness and meditation or about us as integrated physical and spiritual beings? Anything that we've talked about today.
Yeah. So one book that I would recommend, and I think a lot of people have read it, but The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry,
That's a good one.
by John Mark. Have you read that book?
I have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a really good book. And I think it just helps us understand like the culture that we're in and what we view as normal shouldn't be normal. I think another book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, is a good book. There are also, if we're talking about like meditation and mindfulness, there are also Christian-based meditation apps that are out there. Abide is one, Soul Time is one. Calm is out there. Calm is not Christian-based, but it is a meditation app that I think some people have found helpful. But then there's a lot of teachings out there on meditation and mindfulness. I do like the Bible Project and the teachings that they have on there.
Yeah, that's great. We could do a whole other episode on, using like non-Christian, quote unquote, resources because all truth comes from God. And if it helps us to slow down, then we are able to fill our minds with scripture and things that we know teach us God's truth.
Right.
So that's really helpful. Ekpe, do you have any closing thoughts? Anything you want to leave our listener with?
I encourage the listeners to focus. I'm in this space where I'm looking at the characteristics of God that we as human beings usually ignore. And I think rest is one. Like God is, talked about rest. And when you look at the scriptures, there's so much about that. I would love for our listeners to study that out more and just embrace this rest that God talks about, that God is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is, a countercultural way of looking at things, like feeling that our identity is in our own productivity or in, like how many emails we send or respond to or anything like that. I think that the resources that you named will be really helpful too. So we've talked about mindfulness and meditation and how those are biblically rooted practices. We've talked about our minds and our bodies and how spiritual disciplines can inform us in our relationship with God, but also can impact us physiologically. And we've talked about how in all of those things that awareness of our thoughts and emotions can help us to draw near to God, which is what He invites us to do in a variety of circumstances. So, Ekpedeme, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Kasey. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, and we want to thank you, our listener, for being with us. If you like our show, go ahead and leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast app so that others can discover us. And we hope that you'll join us next time when we discuss issues of God and culture to show the relevance of theology to everyday life.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.